Mr. Haydn. So we're moving from Haydn to Beethoven tonight. This was the transition show, and I didn't put it in my email, and I've only mentioned it on the Zoom last week, that starting next week we're doing a Beethoven festival for the next 3 months. And if you go on to our website for the Inside the Music on the webpage, you'll see the entire program mapped out for the next 3 months that I've put together of shows. I believe it's 13 shows, I'm not sure, 13 or 14 shows. Really just doing an incredibly deep dive into Beethoven during this 250th anniversary year. So it's been it took a long time for me to curate that festival. And it was really fascinating to listen to all those recordings and everything. And I hope you really enjoy that. The idea is that we're traversing his entire career from the early period, in the middle period to the late period. And so this show tonight was really connecting Haydn and Beethoven, teacher with student, and going forth and going forward. I promised earlier I was going to start tonight discussing the dedicee of the Opus 77 number 2 and the full set of Opus 18 quartets of Beethoven, and that's Prince Lobkowitz, who was the dedicee of these pieces, and other pieces that were dedicated to him. And when you say they're dedicated to them, that means this guy put up the money for these pieces. So these are the pieces that this prince helped create. So you have the Haydn Opus 77 quartets. He sponsored the first performance of Haydn's Creation. He was Beethoven's Third Symphony, the Eroica, the Fifth and the Sixth Symphony were dedicated to Lobkowitz. The Opus 18 and Opus 74 quartets, the Triple Concerto, On die Ferne Geliebte, the song cycle. And he also wrote specifically a work with that opus, a birthday cantata for the prince. So this prince was a very important man in the classical period, in the late classical period. And the Lobkowitz family, I wrote it down, owned 11 castles and palaces throughout Bohemia, in addition to the one that they had in Vienna. And the palace in Vienna is still there, and one of the oldest buildings still existent in Vienna, the Lobkowitz Palace. And he had his own orchestra. And interestingly, when Beethoven was approached to be a Kapellmeister in the town of Kassel in, I think it was 1808, Lobkowitz got the Archduke Rudolph and another prince to pay Beethoven an annual pension for the rest of his life to keep him in Vienna. And Beethoven took him up on that. Mm-hmm. So Lobkowitz was a very, very, very important figure in Beethoven's life. Very important. And I wanted to share something with you. Here it is. And on one of our river cruises, we went to Prague, where a Lobkowitz palace is part of the Prague Castle. So here we have the manuscript and original parts of Haydn's Opus 77, Opus 77 quartets. And how do I get to the next? It's not letting me get to the next thing. Oh no, hold on. Oh dear, it's not, I have and also the Beethoven. Where can I go? Hold on. I will stop that share. Bear with me, I apologize. I really have to get better with this. And here is the Beethoven manuscript of the Opus 18 quartets. And these are available in Prague. If you go to the Lobkowitz Palace when everything calms down and you can get to Prague, you go to the palace, and not only does he have those two manuscripts, he has all of the instruments of the orchestra, of the court orchestra in this museum that premiered the Eroica Symphony and Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. And it has the parts, the score and the parts to the Beethoven's Fifth Symphony with Beethoven's corrections in them. It's fascinating. Really, really great stuff. Great stuff. So I wanted to start that. I was going to finish with that, but the Lobkowitz family was, and this prince, this specific prince, he was an amateur musician, just like the Esterházy prince, and just poured his money and support into Haydn and Beethoven's career. Amazing. So here we have Haydn. Haydn, the last quartet, he was going to deliver 6 quartets to Lobkowitz, and he could only do 2. And Haydn at the time was around 67 years old, which back in the turn of the 18th century is comparable probably to 85 now. He was quite elderly, and at the time he had all of these major works happening. He did the Creation, which he finished in 1798. He had the Seasons, which he finished in 1801, and he had a Mass that he worked on for the Esterházy family in 1799. So he had all of these massive works and all of these things going. And I have a letter here that he wrote to his publisher, Breitkopf and Hertels, which is one of the oldest music publishing houses in the world, and it still exists. And he wrote to the publisher, "I'm really very much ashamed to have to offend a man who has written so often and honored me with so many marks of esteem, which I do not deserve, by answering him at this late date. It is not negligence on my part, but the vast amount of business which is responsible. And the older I get, the more business I have to transact daily. I only regret that on account of my growing age and unfortunately the decrease of my mental powers, I am able to dispatch only but the smallest part of it. Every day the world pays me compliments on the fire of my recent works, but no one will believe the strain and effort it cost me to produce them. There are some days in which my enfeebled memory and the unstrung state of my nerves crush me to the earth, to such an extent that I fall prey to the worst sort of depression, and thus am quite incapable of finding even a single idea for many days thereafter, until at last Providence revives me and I can again sit down at the pianoforte and begin to scratch away. Enough of this." So Haydn was done. Haydn was tired. Haydn was at the end of the line here. And here he is creating, like, the Opus 77 quartets are just astounding works, and the 77 number 2 especially, which is, you know, considered the pinnacle of classical music, classical period quartet writing. What do you think of the performance?
Very good.
Yeah?
Electrifying.
Yeah, I think that the Jupiter did a great job, and it has the very extravagant first violin part, which is very indicative of the Haydn quartets. But I also wanted to share, Delaney had mentioned the minuet movement of the trio, in that, you know, minuets are done in 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. But I wanted to show you the music and show you what Haydn was doing here with the minuet. Oh, sorry, I should have. Here we go. Ba-da-dum, ba-da-dum, bum, 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 bum. So it's dun 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 dun. It's really in two.
Yeah.
It's a hemiola all the way through. Da da dun da da dun 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 dun. Instead of ba da dum bum 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 bum. Ba ba bum ba ba bum ba ba bum 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 bum. And it's through it out. So he's already right there with the minuet. He's playing with you. And then interestingly, and what's most extraordinary, and I think what's most influential about Haydn is in tonality. In the classical period, way early on in my Zoom sessions, we went over what sonata allegro form was and traditional harmonic structure. In the classical period, we talked about the relationship between tonic and dominant, meaning the tonic key being the key of the piece, in this case, F major, and then the dominant, which is the fifth a chord based on the fifth note, which is F, G, B, A, C. So the relationship between tonic and dominant, and these relationships go back and forth throughout the classical period, the dominant that naturally resolves to the tonic. So classical period music was structured with a lot of those relationships where a piece starts in F major, in the middle it goes to C major, and then it gets back to F major. So in this minuet, he goes in F major, and he goes about his business, and he's messing with the meter of it. He's giving you hemiola over and over and over again. But then we get to the trio, and he gets to D flat major from F major, which is very strange.
It's very unusual.
Very strange. So D flat major and F major are very distant keys from one another. It's a flat six chord. So the sixth chord of F major, D flat major, and he flats it. So audiences of that time, when this trio came in, they're like, what? It was just very, very, very strange. And then what he novelly does, so how does he get back from D flat major to F major? He adds a coda before it gets back to the top of the minuet, where he cycles through A flat major, B flat minor, and then C major, which is the dominant of F major, getting back to the top of F major.
Mm-hmm.
So in order to connect this weird key, D flat major, Haydn slaps on this little coda where he modulates back eventually to F major. It's wonderful. I mean, I know that's, I'm doing a deep dive into harmony,
Mm-hmm.
but to have a B section in classical music where the key is from F major to D flat major is weird,
Mm-hmm.
completely and utterly weird. And Haydn stretched the boundaries of these things.
It's usually a relative minor.
I'm sorry?
It's usually a relative minor or something relating to.
Yeah, it's a completely foreign key. So in this piece alone, I mapped it out. The first movement starts, we do F major, and then it goes to C major, the tonic and dominant. And then during the development section where he's developing these ideas, he goes as far away as E flat minor in F major, which is a flat two chord in the minor. Very weird, like completely weird. And then you have the minuet, he goes D major, F major to D flat major. And then the andante, he starts from F major, he starts the third movement in D major, which is weird, completely weird, okay? And then like the last movement, he goes back to F major, but he doesn't do a typical rondo in the last movement, he does a sonata allegro. So he's taking the norms of that period and just tossing them to the wind, Haydn. And that will influence Beethoven later. So I have a quote here from a book This is a really wonderful book. It's called Haydn, Mozart, and Early Beethoven by Daniel Hertz. And he says, although Opus 77 number 2 finishes with a strong finale, some of the more puzzling aspects in the other movements, as well as their sequence of keys, odd even for late Haydn, cannot but raise suspicions that the work gave its creator uncommon trouble. This might have had something to do with its lack of a direct successor. More likely, Haydn left off composing quartets mainly because he was so pressured by other compositional tasks, besides all the business he was conducting. By summer of 1799, he was working on another mass ordered by the prince to honor his wife. Also, much of the work on a new oratorio occurred in 1799. It is not surprising then that these labors began taking their toll on his health. So Mr. Hertz is basically saying this guy was tired and old, and he just was struggling with this piece, and then he just sort of fashioned these things together. I'm not sure I agree with that assessment. I'm not sure I agree with the assessment. Mm-hmm. But he does it still with all of the Haydn charm and all of the wonderful wit that he comes. I wanted to play, you know, this tonight we lopped off a movement of each of these pieces. I wanted to play the last movement of the Haydn quartet because it's really one of his truly marvelous finales. So let's listen to the last movement of Haydn Opus 77 number 2.
This is a ballet who between lateral arabesques.
What'd you think?
Exceptional. It was. I was particularly struck in this listening to the work with the bows, the precision of the bowing attacks and the bow, the quick bow work was absolutely beautiful. I mean, the whole thing was wonderful performance. The vitality of it, the life, just beautiful.
I think vitality is a really, yeah. I mean, you really, it's just, poof, you know, it's so much energy in this movement, and it's really, it's just really a delightful, energetic finale. And then you had the first fiddle just ripping away in the middle of it, you know, in that lick. Yeah, it just flies over the top, and yeah, it's
doesn't sound like the work of a tired old man.
Right. Interesting, right?
I'll say something unfair to Haydn. It sounds like Beethovenian in his kind of obsession with that da 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 da, and how it. I mean, it gets all throughout the parts, and it's, you know, I mean, you get distracted listening to the first violin just with fireworks, but then it's also fun listening to how the other three instruments are just tossing around da 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 da. It's yeah, I mean, he really, you know, takes that form and just squeezes, well, I'm doing the opposite, squeezes it for all it's worth. And it was similar. I mean, didn't we just see in the third movement where, I mean, the same thing, but if I'm remembering correctly, the same rhythm there, da-da-da, here and there, not as maybe focused on that rhythm, but that's interesting.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's there. You're absolutely right. And it's a driving force beneath what's happening above it in this movement. Yeah. Anyone else about Haydn 77 number 2?
Speaking from my old age as perspective, I can't believe he could do that at his age of 80 plus.
No, he was in his 60s. It's just back then it just felt like that. Yeah, he was. You know, he was. But Haydn in his life, you know, he was, because, you know, obviously because of the skill of his compositions, but you know, he held this prominent position throughout his life at the Esterhazy Palace, and later in his life he became very famous, traveling to London and going and people seeking him out all over Europe. He was traveling all the time as an older man, and you hear in his letter that he takes on these large works, and he just feels like they're just, you know, it's just too much for him to get by, and the humility at which he expresses to his publisher about these quartets. It's wonderful.
Yeah.
Really wonderful. So then we have Mr. Beethoven, and Haydn and Beethoven. I alluded to it in the show. You know, it was a complicated relationship. Beethoven was this fiery upstart. Haydn was this older gentleman, very staid and very busy, obviously. And you know, Beethoven just felt like Haydn wasn't paying him very much attention, and was very crusty about it. But when it came to quartets, you know, Beethoven started, and we'll see in next week's show about, he kicked off his career with 3 piano trios, the Opus 1 piano trios. And he chose those piano trios because he chose to write in that idiom, because piano trios weren't an important part of Haydn and Mozart's output. He felt that the symphonic writing and the quartet writing, and of course opera, were the most things. So he wanted to go and make his mark on a piano trio, and he avoided string quartets, and he avoided them for 6 years until he started working on the Opus 18 quartets. And the set of Opus 18 were composed between 1798 and 1800. The date of the Opus 77 number 2 is 1799. So they were simultaneous. By the time Beethoven completed his Opus 18, the Haydns were not published. He only had the Opus 76 quartets published at the time. And who's to say if Beethoven had heard Opus 77 number 2? But Beethoven worked on these quartets for 2 years, when back then that is a very, very long time, fashioning these quartets. And in preparation to write these quartets, he actually took to copying all of the Opus 20 quartets of Haydn. He hand wrote all of Haydn's Opus 20 quartets to study them, so he can study them intently as to what the master composer was doing. So he very, very much respected Haydn, Beethoven, and he was very wary, in a smaller degree than someone say Brahms was wary of Beethoven later on, where he would wait 20 years to write his symphonies. But to write a quartet was a big deal back in that day. And I have a passage from the Jan Swafford biography about this very thing. And he says, with Haydn, there was a sense that quartets were the ultimate test, not only of a composer's craft, but of his heart and soul, his most refined and intimate voice. It was understood that in composing a quartet, it was appropriate to be more subtle, idiosyncratic, and complex than in big public places. So that the quartet of the day, back in this time when you had Haydn writing these quartets, they were more prevalent in homes. People who would play stringed instruments would get together and play these quartets. And then you have Mozart writing his 6 quartets dedicated to Haydn. That the quartet was a very popular musical form to write in, and this is where he felt that you could be most innovative in the writing of the quartet. It's very, very interesting. So, and I was very grateful that Misha Amory could speak with me about that. Did anybody have any thoughts about what Misha said about these quartets?
Yeah, they were difficult.
Right.
It was funny that he sort of expressed the difficulty as a player.
Yeah, right. Difficult. You just said
that. And I think he was trying to make the point that the Haydns sit very well in the fiddles, and sit very well, and these are a little cumbersome to play.
Mm-hmm. Hard
easily, a little cumbersome. But in speaking with, about taking, that he said that it's distinctly, these are classical quartets for sure, that they're based upon Haydn, but he innovates in these quartets, that Beethoven is innovating in these quartets. And this particular quartet that I chose tonight lacks a slow movement, which in itself of the time is very strange. And that it has a scherzo, both a scherzo and a minuet. And I wanted to share a little bit of the score of the minuet. Where is it? Sorry, hold on. It's pulling up the Haydn. There it is. And so you see a similarity in the displacement of beats that he's taking from Haydn, that it's a little unsteady. You see these sforzandi on weak beats in 1, 2, 3, da 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 da. So he's emphasizing it, and then in the B section here, you see here he's sforzando. He's emphasizing the second beat and then the third beat, second beat, third beat. He's doubling. The cello is against the other sforzandi, and it gives a sense of displacement and discomfort in these things. And here's another thing, if we're talking about harmony, and I talked about with a Haydn about tonic and dominant. So here he starts in E flat major. So the dominant key would be B flat major. And here he comes in the trio and he goes to A flat major. Borrowing from Haydn to give a little surprise. Going from B flat major, I'm sorry, to E flat major to the subdominant A flat major was a very uncommon practice. Very, very uncommon practice in the classical period. And you can see that he's borrowing from what Haydn had done previously in Opus 77, number 2. And throughout, we'll see in Beethoven's development, he starts messing with these traditions about this should be this way with harmony, 5, that the dominant and tonic will be so related. He will go to keys that are not readily, weren't readily acceptable to connect with in the classical period throughout his career. And here he is with the scherzo, and Misha had said it in his interview, that he's got the scherzo that's a little too slow and a minuet that's a little too fast. It's a very staid scherzo, which you would think that a scherzo would be more energetic and bubbly, and then he takes the minuet and it's a little too fast to dance this minuet. So Beethoven is messing with us in this way. And again, since we didn't play the last movement of this piece, I wanted to play the last movement of Beethoven, Opus 18, number 4, and it's about 5 minutes. Here we go, and this is again the Brentano Quartet.
Wow.
What do you think about that?
Everybody seems
Wonderful.
no, I like that, but I'm trying to think. It's a complete change. About 2/3 of the way through, a complete reversal in style, and then he goes back.
Yeah, it's rondo form. You know, you've got this very stark minor,
Yeah.
and then he gives you a contrasting calm major, and then he goes
Yeah,
back
right.
to the first
Then he goes
minor,
back
and
to
then he
the
gives you
minor.
a different major.
Yeah.
But how about that coda, that last part when he steps up the tempo a bit? You know, and there's sort of a slight, I hate to say, a gypsy feel to this movement.
I think he tests them. Like
I was
he's
thinking, I was hearing that, I was thinking of the Brahms piano quartet that
Yeah,
played a few weeks ago.
that's
That
right.
last movement.
That's a great analogy, Gary. Absolutely. And then you have that very fast coda as well, where it's just complete barn burner to the end, you know? And you know, and then Beethoven here, he's ending in major. He's giving you major, just C major at the end there, right at the end. Perhaps a harbinger for his Fifth Symphony. But just, you know, this is his first venture into the realm, and while I would agree with Misha that this is definitely a classical period piece, and these quartets are classical period, you see the hints of what's to come. You see how he's innovating and doing these things. You see how he's taking what Haydn has provided to him, and he will then just turn it on its head in 25 years. As I'd said, you know, it's amazing from this point of these pieces, and then Opus 135, 25 years later, and where he goes in that time. It's just incredible what this man did.
Do you have any thoughts of what was going on in his head when he switched to that presto conclusion? Just to add excitement, or it's not the only place that he does that.
No.
The place where he switches to a presto, you know, a doubling or tripling of the tempo at the end to build some intensity at the end. But do you have any thoughts of why what was going on in his head to do that?
I don't see Beethoven as a composer that puts in elements to please audiences. I think that speaking to that sort of flair of the gypsy in this movement, and that Gary, and that later that Brahms does, I think it's just, you know, he's got this very energetic minor. It's very minor. It's a little, I don't know, it's not spooky, but it's you know, it's a little mercurial, the theme, you know, it's very, I don't know. It's hard for me to describe what it is, But I think he's just like, okay, we've got this. We did the tune, we did the contrast, we did the tune, we did the contrast, and let's just end this sucker with a bang. I think that's what's really, I can't speak to what he was thinking, but I don't see him as a composer to elicit response in a way that, for instance, that Haydn would do with things like something like, like the Surprise Symphony or the Farewell Symphony.
Plus, there was also another kind of punctuation where dun da da dum bum ba dum, and he holds it. It does that a couple of times. So that's almost the polar opposite of the presto passage, where he's kind of taking a deep breath and then starting it again.
I think that he uses that throughout his career. I think that's prevalent in the Fifth Symphony in the first movement, where he uses silence against action, and he puts in silences to create drama. I just want to get back that this is this guy's first crack. This is his biggest. He didn't write his first symphony yet. This was his biggest step forward in his compositional career. Writing a set of string quartets. It was the tradition, I should add, I don't want to take this for granted, it was a tradition to write 6 quartets as a set, that you would provide sets of 6 quartets.
6 quartets.
And which is why he did this. But knowing the specter of Haydn preceding him, and then utilizing things that Haydn was doing, and knowing that when he was going to work on quartets in his own writing, that he would take to hand copying a full set of Haydn string quartets in preparation to do that. Speaks volumes. It speaks volumes. But again, as I said in the interview with Misha, from Opus 1, number 1, it's Beethoven. It's not Haydn. It's Beethoven.
Your comment earlier about, or just that Beethoven wasn't necessarily trying to please the audience, and then Misha's earlier comment that the Haydn string writing lays easier on the instrument than Beethoven's writing. I've heard singers say that the same thing for Beethoven's vocal music. It doesn't sit as easily on the voice. He was off in a different realm than most of us, perhaps.
Absolutely, I think that. I mean, and just wait a few years and you'll see it.
Yeah.
But interestingly, with his operatic, right? I mean, Fidelio. He spent decades on Fidelio, writing and rewriting Fidelio. It was a huge failure when it first appeared. And this is why we have the multiple overtures. There's 4 overtures to Fidelio as an opera. He kept rewriting and rewriting, and he felt like it didn't fit him. Now, Ande Ferne Geliebte is a marvelous little song cycle. Marvelous little song cycle. And for money, he had transcribed. I was actually going to include it in this full festival, and maybe I'll play some of them. But he transcribed some of these Irish and Scottish folk songs in his career for money, and he's got this full set where you have a singer with a piano trio doing Irish and Scottish folk songs. Is anybody familiar with those? Yeah, they're without an opus. I'll play some, I promise. Very neat stuff. But he did it for money. He got some guy to pay him to do it, and he did it. So I've got an old recording of them. But Beethoven from the beginning, borrowing from the past, of course, was Beethoven. And this is why he was able, this is why he's such an important figure in music, but why he was able to bridge the classical with the romantic, along with Schubert. With Beethoven, he was so innovative. And then when his deafness comes on later, we talk about, we're even talking about him in his own world right now, and then he gets more isolated and insular, and then creates an entire universe of expression that had never been seen before.
We were told a story about Beethoven that, and near the end of his life, he thought people did not like what he did because he couldn't hear the applause. Is that a true story, or is that just something they tell you in music schools?
No, there's a story of when he would be conducting and he was almost completely deaf and he wasn't with the musicians.
Okay.
He was generally toward the end of his life derided as a crazy deaf man.
Yeah.
And not taken very seriously.
Mm. Mm.
But when we get to the late quartets and these late piano sonatas, I mean, it's like the Mona Lisa. It's the same level of artistic genius, and over again. I mean, he's Da Vinci. He's creating these things that will endure long after we're all around, and for many generations after. I mean, there's a reason why I'm spending 3 months on Beethoven. Not just because it's his birthday. So, any other thoughts? Well, thank you, everybody. I appreciate you coming a little bit later this evening.
Yep.
And we'll see you next week as we begin from the beginning of Beethoven's career.
And thanks for your insights. They're always appreciated.
Thank you. Have a good night, everybody.
Good
night, Derek. Sorry I showed up at 7. I don't read emails very
I know. I should have followed up with everybody, but yeah.
Okay. Anyway, thank you. It was good program.
I'm glad you came back.
Me too.
8 o'clock worked just fine for me.
Great. Bye, everybody.